Welcome to JIIA's webinar, The Political Impact of European Military Presence in the Indo-Pacific. I am Tomiko Ichikawa, Director General of the Japan Institute of International Affairs. On behalf of the organizer, JIIA, I would like to welcome all the listeners to this event. First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Ken Endo for taking the initiative for organizing this very timely event and also for chairing today's webinar. I'd like to also thank the speakers and discussants who are really joining today's webinar from many parts of the world. Thank you very much to you all. And above all, I'd like to welcome and thank all the listeners for taking your time in logging into this, I believe, very, very timely event. As we are expecting all the prominent speakers to explain from their point of view, I will not go into the details of today's webinar. Just let me say that we are really witnessing quite remarkable interest by the European countries in this Indo-Pacific region, which has been most visibly demonstrated by successive dispatch of their naval ship to this region. While we are witnessing these events, we believe it is really necessary for us to understand the background of their political decisions and the impact of these activities and policies for this region, as well as for the European countries themselves. For this purpose, we have managed to gather such a prominent lineup of experts today who will, I'm sure, enlighten our understanding of the issues and help us better understand and understand their reasonings and to think about our future in this region. So with that remarks, I'd like to welcome again all the speakers and discussants and listeners, and I'd like to ask Professor Endo to take the floor. Professor Endo, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Director General Ichikawa. My name is Ken Endo. I'm going to chair this session. I'm a professor at the Hokkaido University, as well as the adjunct fellow at this JIIA. The record number of 190 have registered into this event, and I'd like to thank you very much for your keen interest. And your interest is well justified, as Europe itself has shown recently an increasing strategic interest in the region of Indo-Pacific. On 16th September 2021, the European Commission and the High Representative presented a joint communication on the EU's Indo-Pacific strategy. The French government had previously published its Indo-Pacific strategy in July, a few days after the President Macron has visited Japan and French Polynesia. Germany has also undertaken a new challenge. It sent a warship to the South China Sea in August. For the first time in almost 2 decades, Germany has deepened its interest in the Indo-Pacific region ever since it released the policy guideline for the Indo-Pacific region in 2020. On the other hand, the UK has significantly strengthened its engagement in Indo-Pacific after Brexit, dispatching new aircraft carrier, the Queen Elizabeth, to the region. Furthermore, on 15th of September, the US, UK, and Australia announced that they would form a new trilateral security partnership called AUKUS, which signals their deepening commitment in the region. Against this backdrop, this webinar is intended to explore the strategic calculations behind the growing military presence of Europe in the Indo-Pacific and to assess its political impact. And I'm thrilled and much honored to have three distinguished speakers, in fact, rising stars in this field. The first, Dr. Antoine Bondas, the research fellow and the director of both the Korea program and the Taiwan program at the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique in Paris, as well as he's the associate professor at Sciences Po, Paris, where I think you obtained a PhD there. And his research focuses on China, Taiwan, Korea's foreign and security policy, and strategic interest issues in East Asia. He advises the senior government officials, in fact, inclusive of the President de la République, Monsieur Macron, before his receiving Xi Jinping in Paris. The second speaker is Dr. Alexandra Sakaki. She has obtained a bachelor at Princeton and a PhD at Trier before joining the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik back in 2012. Her expertise focuses on East Asia, Japan, the Korean Peninsula, covering defense and security policy, regional and interstate conflicts, and Japan's role in the international system. She's in fact a regular contributor to our debate at the JIIA, just as Antoine. The third speaker is Ms. Cleo Pascal at Chatham House. She's an associate fellow at Chatham House in its Environment and Society program and the Asia Pacific program. She is a leader on the Chatham House's project on perceptions of strategic shift in the Indo-Pacific from the point of view of the United States, United Kingdom, India, Japan, Oceania, and France. Also a non-resident senior fellow for the Indo-Pacific Foundation for Defense of Democracy at Washington, D.C. She has lectured, briefed widely at the organizations like Foreign and Commonwealth Office, Royal College of Defense Studies, U.S. Department of State, U.S. Army College, War College, and so on, and widely known as a regular media commentator too. And more, as a discussant, we have Professor Michito Tsuruoka at Keio University, a well-known expert in the field of European security, and recently of the politics surrounding the Indo-Pacific region. He got PhD at King's College London before joining Keio University as a faculty member. He also worked at the National Institute for Defense Studies and was previously attached to the Japan's mission to the European Union and NATO. Was it correct? But anyway, he's the expert of NATO too. Now, we will have 3 speeches and comments in a row. Okay, let's spare time by going straight into the 3 speeches first. First, may I ask Antoine Bonda to kick off the debate. Antoine, are you there?
Sure. Yes, I am.
Please.
Thank you very much, Director General Ichikawa, Professor Endo, Professor Tsuruoka. I mean, it's always a great pleasure to be interacting with our Japanese and European friends and colleagues, even if it's virtual. I will try to be quite brief on the French military presence in the Indo-Pacific and the political consequence of it. I think to start with, it's always easier with some maps, and I think it's quite important to see the specificity of the French military presence compared to the other European ones. Just very briefly, as was reminded to all of you, France was the first actually European country, European power to lay out a strategy. It was in early 2018 during President Macron's visits to Australia. And it was actually refined earlier this year in July 2021, just before the visit to Japan and the visit to French Polynesia. The current Indo-Pacific strategy of the French is much more balanced than it was 2 or 3 years ago. But to be clear, the military and security factor in it is very, very important. It was actually that map center on the Pacific Ocean was actually displayed yesterday on the social network, and it's quite interesting actually to have many Americans saying basically that only Hawaii was in the Pacific and only the US were in the Pacific. But if you check the map actually on the right, that the French presence in the Pacific, from New Caledonia, from Wallis and Futuna, and from French Polynesia. The French are actually a resident power in the Indo-Pacific, and it makes actually the whole difference with the other European countries. So very, very briefly, because I'm not sure all of you are very familiar with the French presence in the region. As you can see, there are 3 main, what we called permanent area of responsibility, one centered in the Indian Oceans around the Reunion Islands, and 2 in the South Pacific, one centered on New Caledonia, the other one centered on French Polynesia. We also have lots, of course, of partnership, defense and security-wise in the regions, as you can see in the dark green, from Japan to India, from Australia to Madagascar, etc. And the French are actually displaying a lot of their military equipment and vessels, as you can see on this map, in the South China Sea, through the Taiwan Strait, in the Indian Ocean, in the South Pacific, etc. And France is participating in most of the major military exercises in the regions with the US, with Japan, with India, with Australia, etc. To put it very briefly, the French have 7,000 military, soldiers permanently deployed in the regions, dozens of vessels and planes. And what is unprecedented was actually the dispatch, the deployments of Rafale, so the French aircraft fighter, from the French continental France to French Polynesia. It was early in June this year, in less than 40 hours. So it was actually the very first time that these Rafale got deployed straight from continental France to French Polynesia in less than 40 hours. And it clearly shows actually, once again, that French is not only a military resident in the region, but it can also deploy quite fast some military assets. Very briefly, of course, on AUKUS, because this is what everyone has been talking about over the last 2 months in Paris, will have huge military consequences in the region for the French. I think we need to put it into perspective. France has had 3 actually top security partners in the regions, India, Australia, and Japan, and of course the US. And de facto the relationship with Australia has been damaged and is compromised in the near future. And as you can see in the press, with the political row between Paris and Sydney, between President Macron and Prime Minister Morrison, is going to keep on going. But does it mean that the French military presence is going to change the regions? Of course not. We have sovereignty interest in the region. It's not going to go anywhere. We will just recalibrate the Indo-Pacific strategy, refocusing even more than before on India and Japan, but also trying to reach out to additional countries such as South Korea and Indonesia. But once again, in terms of military presence, the impact will be quite limited. There are, of course, many areas of cooperation between France and Japan in the Indo-Pacific. A lot is being done already. We have lots of exchanges. Our defense attaché basically go to NIDS, for 1 year before being posted in Tokyo, etc. So we had a lot of things going on. But for sure, there is more than we can do. Cooperation in terms of intelligence sharing is growing. And it was actually very, very important that the French intelligence ship Dupuy de l'Homme was actually dispatched in the region. It still is actually. I think it's in Southeast Asia these days. It's spent actually several weeks in Japan, then crossed the Taiwan Strait. It was, to my knowledge, one of the first time that the maritime intelligence ship from the French did so. So there is one area of cooperation that we can do more, intelligence sharing. The other one, of course, is to keep fighting together against proliferation and in the strict compliance of the international sanctions decided and adopted by the United Nations Security Council, as it is the case actually in the Yellow Sea against some North Korean violation of international sanctions. The third area of cooperation, growing cooperation, is space security. And a third one actually could be additional trilateral framework. As you know, the French had the security framework, let's say, discussion of cooperation with India and Australia. It was a trilateral between Paris, New Delhi, and Canberra. Of course, it's being compromised now by the deterioration of the relation between France and Australia. So one can actually think of additional trilateral framework, France, Japan, with one Southeast Asian country, why not? Or France, India, and Japan. I mean, there are many things that could be discussed. To conclude, because I have 90 seconds left and I will try my best to keep the time, let's talk about the European strategy, or so-called the strategy of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. That's something we discuss more and more in the European format. So we have the very first draft. It's not the final version. Let's be very clear on that, because it will be amended and then adopted by the Council and the Parliament. The strategy for cooperation so far do not focus so much, to be clear, on military. In the 8 priorities, security and defense is not listed, even though security and defense is listed as one of the area of cooperation. I think we need to do more in this aspect. In maritime security, as I think our German friend will explain, we can do more for sure. But in terms of human security, in terms of environmental security, I would say these are the real key added value of the Europeans, much more than traditional military security, because we need to be aware of our own limitation and of some reluctances on the European side. Very last but not least, the issue of Taiwan. I've been working on that publicly and addressed the Parliament and else publicly on that over the last few months repeatedly. I think once again there is we need to do more at the European level, not in terms of military intervention in case, but to make sure that we avoid a conflict, that we deter China from unilaterally changing the status quo, and as such, the European with the Japanese can do much more, even though things are changing quite fast and the Europeans are much more assertive in maintaining the stability than before. So I will stop here to make sure we have time for the questions afterwards.
Great, Antoine. Thank you very much indeed for keeping your time too, as well as the your excellent presentations. Despite the August debacle, the French military presence is there, and the intelligence and other wider security cooperations are still underway. Now, it was great also that you touched upon the Taiwan issue too. Now, let's move on to Alexandra. Can you take the floor, please?
Yes, thank you, Professor Endo, for the kind introduction, and thank you also to everyone at JIIA for doing this seminar and inviting me to be part of the discussion. So as was already said in the introduction, it's a very timely event, this JIIA event, because particularly for Germany, because of the current visit of the German frigate Bayern, which has arrived in Japan, I think last Thursday. And as was said, this is the first German ship in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore also in Japan in almost 2 decades. So this is, in that sense, historically quite significant. And the ship has already, along its route to Asia, done a couple of exercises, passing exercises with the maritime self-defense forces. So against that background, I want to talk about three things today. First of all, I'll address briefly the motivation for Germany's dispatch of the ship. Secondly, I will address the expectations I have for Germany's future engagement. And finally, I'll talk about the significance of German-Japanese security cooperation. So first of all, on the motivation, and here I want to quote German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas on how he explained the ship's deployment. He said, "The Indo-Pacific is where the international order of the future will be decided. We want to help shape it and to take on responsibility for upholding the rules-based international order. And this is why the frigate Bayern is setting sail to Asia." So I think this comment clearly shows a recognition of the strategic significance of the Indo-Pacific region for Germany. And this recognition is also reflected in the German Indo-Pacific guidelines, which were also mentioned at the beginning, which were published in September 2020. And those guidelines, we have to recognize, are very comprehensive. And here I want to emphasize that security is just one of many areas where Germany wants to become more active in the Indo-Pacific. So other fields include things like economics, climate, environment, infrastructure investment, etc. So security is just one, but it is one part of this. So I want to ask, why is the Indo-Pacific becoming more important to Germany? And here I think there's three kind of interrelated reasons that I see. The first, I think, is that there's a realization among policymakers about the enormity of the China challenge, and in particular, China's reach into Europe has really shifted German perceptions of China. So we've seen in the past years, we've seen China trying to create divisions within EU members, like through the 16+1 framework, for example. And this has really been a major concern for Germany. And in that way, Germany has also become more receptive to listening to concerns by Asian countries about China, I think. The second part of it is that Germans have also realized the intensification of Sino-US tensions, which are playing out mostly in the Indo-Pacific. And I think the AUKUS decision, which was already mentioned, has again highlighted that rivalry is intensifying. And this demands German attention because it has global consequences. And finally, I think the economic ties and supply chain links that Germany and Europe has with the Indo-Pacific have also become clearer again through the corona pandemic. So secondly, I want to talk about the expectations I have for Germany's future engagement. So I think Germany is committed to increasing its engagement in the Indo-Pacific. But does that mean Germany will have a more regular military presence in the Indo-Pacific? Here, I want to really caution against over-expectation, particularly in the military realm. And it's not just because Germany doesn't have territories like France in the Indo-Pacific, but also for other reasons. One reason is that Germany simply does not have the military capabilities available to send ships, for example, to the Indo-Pacific. In fact, Germany has struggled to send ships to EU-led operations, for example, in the past years. In this context, I should perhaps mention that there was discussions in the past year to have fighter jets in Australia, German fighter jets in Australia in the next year to continue military presence in the region. But I think this will be something that the next government actually has to decide on in the end. And even if this is decided, I think it will be essentially a symbolic presence more than a substantial one. But beyond capabilities, there's also other reasons why Germany, I think, is unlikely to make hard power presence a key pillar of its engagement with the Indo-Pacific. And here I think we have to recognize that the German dispatch of the frigate has not been completely politically undisputed. particularly politicians in the SPD, kind of the anti-militarist minded social part of the Socialist Party, have raised some questions about the deployment and cautioned against taking positions on territorial disputes in South China Sea. And the way this has been, I think, presented in much of the international media is that Germany is reluctant to take on a military role for fear of causing relations with China to deteriorate. And the argument essentially goes that Germany does not want to upset its China relations for fear of risking its economic ties. Now, I think this may be part of the reason, but I think it would be wrong to see it only through the economic lens, this reluctance. What I think we see is that Germany still struggles with the question to what extent it wants to play a global security role, given that it has conceptualized of itself as an anti-militarist country since 1945, and thus a very constrained security role in the world. And another concern that we see here is that the debate highlights concerns about bipolarity in the international system in Germany. And this, I think, goes to the roots of Germany's Cold War era experience and the success that Germany has had with its Ostpolitik, East policy, which emphasized the need to engage and build trust across the blocks of with the communist countries. So I think in this tradition of Ostpolitik, and also in recognition of the need to cooperate on things like climate change, Germany, I think, is very keen to keep open channels of dialogue with China. So this may be a bit different from other countries. So I think based on that thinking, overall, Germany is more likely to focus on non-traditional security issues in the Indo-Pacific, such as piracy or disaster relief. I want to conclude briefly by highlighting the significance of German-Japanese security cooperation. Now, I think it's clear that Germany and Japan have engaged each other on security more actively. For example, this year we've had the first 2+2 meeting between the foreign and defense ministers of the two countries. Now, even if Germany is unlikely to have a regular and very significant military presence in the Indo-Pacific, I think Germany and Japan can do more to cooperate on security issues in the region. I think both countries can do more to show unity among Western countries by working together on shaping joint messages, for example, in such fora as the G7. So thinking back to the G7 meeting, highlighting, for example, the stability of the Taiwan crisis. And here I think Germany and Japan can do much to shape those messages. So I think from that perspective, it would be important that Japan realizes that Germany is getting a lot more serious about the Indo-Pacific and that this is really an opportunity to engage Germany and deepen bilateral security cooperation. And I want to finish here and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Alexandra, for your threefold presentation. First, on motivation of your engagement, and second, on the limitation of your engagement in this region, as well as the future cooperation between Japan and Germany. Thank you very much. And let's move on to Cleo Pascal. Can you take the floor, please?
Yeah, thank you. I can with great pleasure. Thank you, Professor Endo and Professor Tsuruoka, and especially Ms. Ichikawa and the great team at JIIA.
Sorry to make you awake at midnight. Past two.
It's okay. It's actually 3:30.
So sorry about that.
But you know, but it's worth it, and I'm very grateful to Japan for being a leader on this Indo-Pacific discussion for so long, and for shaping it, and for giving everybody the space to talk to each other about it. So I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to listen to my colleagues. Those were excellent presentations. I'm going to be talking about the UK in spite of my accent. We'll take lots of AUKUS questions should you want them. But I'd like to make the point that AUKUS didn't come out of nothing. So especially since Brexit, which was almost 5 years ago, the British have been very busy in the Indo-Pacific on a wide range of fronts. So, for example, what made headlines recently was on September 27th, the UK's Royal Navy announced that the HMS Richmond, which is a British frigate deployed with the Queen Elizabeth Carrier Strike Group, had conducted operations related to North Korean sanctions busting and had captured evidence of ships apparently breaching UN sanctions and collected updated intelligence on other ships of interest. Then the Richmond sailed to Vietnam through the Taiwan Strait. And that was the first time since 2008 a British warship transited the strait. But it won't take another 13 years for that to happen again. And while AUKUS is the most covered aspect of London's engagement in the Indo-Pacific, reinvigorated engagement, the deal didn't come out of the blue. The momentum has been building for a while, and it was very much linked to what happened with Brexit. In December 2016, in a speech given by then Foreign Minister Boris Johnson, he explained his rationale and vision for a global Britain. A lot of people made fun of him, but there were soon small moves towards reawakening existing, if ignored, networks. So, for example, in 2018, at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, Johnson announced the opening of 9 new diplomatic missions in Commonwealth countries, including in the Pacific Islands of Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu. These are countries that have long histories with the UK, and the role of the Pacific Islands in the Indo-Pacific is a very interesting one, and it plays into the Five Eyes relationship and the London-Washington relationship, and the potential role for Tokyo in it is very high. So we can talk about that later. Anyway, also during the Theresa May post-Brexit, but before COVID era, there were 2 very deep divides that acted as roadblocks in London to making decisions about the Indo-Pacific. So the first division was between those who signed on to a global Britain and those who thought the UK was, as one policymaker at a Chatham House research meeting said the UK should start thinking of ourselves as a middle power. What do middle powers do? Conflict, peacekeeping, diplomacy. So had kind of sort of a different level of expectations. The second division was one that we find in many countries, and it's something that Dr. Sakaki mentioned, which is how to handle China. So there are deep and old engagement with China lobbies in the UK. There's a lot of Chinese money in the UK, and those lobbies are mostly in the financial and political sectors, and some in the city, the financial center, said that Chinese investment would be essential for post-Brexit UK prosperity. Others in the UK, especially from the defense, intelligence, and security communities, were concerned about the depth of influence Beijing already had in the UK and were worried about it getting more. So they wanted to limit China's role in the country while building partnerships and strengthening alliances with democratic partners. So the result, kind of a very good touchstone for figuring out where a country is on China, is what they do about Huawei. So during that period, the UK was not making a decision about Huawei. Then came COVID-19 and China's at best unhelpful position on information sharing about the nature of the virus. There are also a series of aggressive actions by Beijing across the region, and especially, and this was very important for London, the passing of the Hong Kong related security law, which created a real problem for London in trying to define its position. So those in the UK who are concerned about China and who saw potential in global Britain, which were often overlapping groups, started to gain traction And they were encouraged by Washington. Remember, this was the previous administration in Washington, and they were also very concerned about China, and they wanted to see Democratic allies take a bigger role. So we saw a whole series of events take place that started to give an indication of where the UK was thinking of heading. So I'll list some of them and I'll give you an idea. You can see the engagement starting to develop. The first very big announcement was in July 2020 when the UK government announced it would be extending residency rights to up to 3 million British national overseas citizens in Hong Kong. And that looked very much like a decision saying we might lose the money from Beijing into the city, but we have these potentially 3 million other people who might bring a different sort of investment. And anyways, we have some sort of responsibility there. In July 2020, this was another big one, the government announced it would remove Huawei equipment from UK's 5G networks by 2027, but at least they made an announcement. Again, in July, Japan, and this is a two-way thing, Japan changed its laws to allow more intelligence sharing with the UK, also with Australia, India, and France, others. In October 2020, the UK and Japan agreed a free trade agreement. In November, Prime Minister Johnson announced a once-in-a-generation modernization of the military with billions in new funding. The plans included the creation of a new center for AI and cyber, and I'm going to try to see if my French colleague can not laugh, restoring Britain as the foremost naval power in Europe. In March 2021, the UK government announced its integrated review that was described as the biggest review of foreign defense and development policy since the Cold War. And the review included the famous Indo-Pacific tilt policy, which is a major shift from just a few years ago when the government was still calling the region the Far East. It took a long time for them to even change the terminology. In June 2021, the UK and Australia agreed a free trade agreement. Also in that month, Biden and Johnson signed the new Atlantic Charter, which was very interesting. If you want, we can talk about it later. Also in June, US F-35s on the Queen Elizabeth flew the first American combat mission. It was against IS from a foreign carrier since World War II. US Marines deployed with the Carrier Strike Group had been training with the British for months, and a senior US official said, imagine a world where you're agnostic as to whether the ship you're operating from has USS or HMS on it. That really increases flexibility and the potential lethality of both nations. In July 2021, the UK said it would permanently deploy 2 vessels to the Indo-Pacific. Of course, that's nothing compared to what the French have. In September, we have AUKUS. And in September 28, again, Britain said it would begin formal negotiations with Japan to deepen the defense relationship. So that list is far from complete. It leaves many gaps. There are a lot of promises and they're far from commitment, but it just shows AUKUS is not a one-off. And there's still more for the UK to build on, like the 5 Powers Defense Agreement, their intel networks, the very good intelligence networks, commercial influence, IMO is headquartered in London, but there are, of course, serious weak spots within UK's position. The French have a much better relationship with India than the British do, for example. So where are we now? The Indo-Pacific has become the focus for several very serious overlapping security constructs, including the Five Eyes, the Quad, and now AUKUS. Post-Brexit UK, the UK is a core member of 2 of the 3, Five Eyes and AUKUS, and it has the potential to be a plus in the Quad in some areas. It's knitting itself into the region's security architecture. It has a lot of catching up to do. Its capacities may not meet its expectations, but the British have been busy and they're trying to prove their worth in the region. They see the 21st century as the Indo-Pacific century and are trying to build on its Atlantic relationships to improve its position in the Indo-Pacific. That's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Indeed, UK is quite busy. Engaging despite the internal differences in orientation, forming a new pattern of growing engagements into the east of Suez. Well, that's why we are busy too. But anyway, so let's move on to the commentator, Dr. Tsuruoka Michito, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to this. Yes, listening to three brilliant remarks, there are already the many takeaways, and I have learned quite a lot, so I very much appreciate your remarks. Talking about European military engagement in the Pacific region, the first message from Tokyo is that we very much welcome. So the good news is that the European military engagement is getting more substantial. So in terms of the things that you bring to the region, the things are getting more substantial and serious. So if you look at the joint training exercises, we are becoming more serious. And also your deployment, your engagement is becoming more frequent. So which is another aspect of a very positive element of what we are seeing. And also the more countries are joining. So traditionally, of course, the UK and France are the foremost European powers, which have some sort of presence in this region. So in the French case, of course, you have territories and people, but the UK also has always been a sort of resident power in the region as well. But now if you look at the carrier strike group, so the Dutch frigate was part of that, and also German frigate is now in Tokyo. So the more and more countries, in addition to the UK and France, are getting on board, which is very much welcomed in Tokyo. So but at the same time, I see some challenges or homework for Japan, because I think Japan hasn't been quite able to make full use of opportunities offered by European engagement in this region. So I believe that we could have done more, and more things could have done. So I believe that Tokyo needs to come up with a clearer strategy of using taking advantage of European military engagement in this region. So for the purpose of course, the enhancing the rules-based international order here in the Indo-Pacific region, but at the same time, ultimately, we can think of working with Europeans to enhance and improve, strengthen the regional deterrence posture, including vis-a-vis, of course, China. So there are still the things that we need to think about in Tokyo, and the negotiating the Reciprocal Access Agreement, RAA, the mini SOFA type of agreement, is something that we have on the table. So just a few weeks ago, the Japan and the UK started formal negotiations for the RAA, and I'm quite sure that we can think of having it with France as well. So based on that, let me ask you a couple of questions. So generic question to three speakers, and also one question each to your respective presentations. And first, a common question is about China's narrative on European engagement in the region, because the Beijing's message and Beijing's belief and Beijing's discourse is always that it's all about China and US. It's all about Sino-American competition. So Americans are not prepared to accept the rise of China. And Americans are pushing Europeans to get on board. And Americans are trying to draw Europeans into its competition with China. So this sort of a discourse is something that Beijing wants the world to believe. But I very much believe that European engagement in the Indo-Pacific region is primarily for Europe's own interest. So you are here for your own interest. But I'm curious how you would respond to such China's discourse, that it's all about China and the US, and the Americans are trying to draw you into Sino-American conflict. But at the same time, apart from China's discourse, at the same time, it's a good thing for Japan to know that Europeans are cooperating very well with Americans in the region, particularly European navies and the US Navy have been cooperating quite well. So the Guam is sort of a hub for European vessels, so which is quite encouraging. So but at the same time, I think that so from that perspective, I believe that there is a sort of a US element in your engagement in the Indo-Pacific region. Of course, superficially, you can argue that your engagement is for the purpose of showing to Americans that you are a reliable partner in the Indo-Pacific region as well. But that's sort of a US element. To what extent you see such a US element in your respective engagement in the Indo-Pacific region? That's my first common question to you. And the second common question to you is that I'm wondering about how we could ensure synergies between your respective engagement and also the NATO's engagement or the EU's engagement. So the Britain, France, Germany, these individual countries, they have their own, of course, engagement in this region, but at the same time, NATO is increasingly interested in China issues. And EU, of course, is a huge player. So and seen from Tokyo, yes, they're cooperating with such various actors in Europe is good, but at the same time, we want to think about how we could streamline this structure, so how we could put various things together and how we could ensure synergies. That's what I'm thinking about. So the EU, NATO synergies from your perspective, is EU's role and NATO's role, and also in this context particularly, what I'm thinking about is the role of E3, the Britain, France, and Germany framework. So it's quite a great opportunity that we have three representatives from the E3 countries, all of E3 countries. So now perhaps because of AUKUS, there are some political problems there, but still, from our perspective, keeping the UK involved in our conversation with Europe, with the EU, is very important for us. Not only for the sake of efficiency, but also based on the fact that the UK is an indispensable European power in thinking about European engagement in this region. So the E3's role is something that I would like to hear your opinion on. And very quickly, the three separate questions, and the first question is for France. My impression is that yes, the AUKUS is a huge news, but my impression is that the people are interested in AUKUS, or people got interested in AUKUS because of France's fierce opposition and reaction to that. So if there was no such a huge reaction from Paris, then people might not have been that interested in that. So the France's reaction sort of attracted people's interest in AUKUS. So is this something that Paris intended, or that's what I'm thinking about? And the question to the UK about the UK is that yes, you talked a lot about the UK's increasing relations with Commonwealth countries. And AUKUS is very much sort of part of that, because AUKUS is very much about Anglosphere type of a framework and grouping. So tilt to the Indo-Pacific, yes, it's one thing, but at the same time, to what extent do you think this is also tilt to the Commonwealth, or tilt to Anglosphere? Because the CPTPP is also very close to Anglosphere or Commonwealth type of things, because they are out of 11 countries. I think there are 6 Commonwealth countries, right? So from London's perspective, it's also about strengthening relations with old friends and partners or families. So that's what I'm wondering. And finally, very quickly on a question on Germany. we are very much interested in coalition negotiations in Germany. And in the Japanese press, there are many articles actually on how the three parties are talking about China. But what I'm wondering is that to what extent China is really a big issue in coalition negotiations. That's my specific question on Germany. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your detailed question. Common questions, two questions: nature of China narratives and the US elements in it. And another common question: how to ensure the energies between the three powers. In relation to this question, how to ensure the synergy of three powers, Valerie Nikkei asked more or less the same question. Is there any coordinated regular mission to support the rule of law and support the EU flag in the region? She asks separately. So and to Antoine Aucas's real meaning, to Claire, I think I missed part of it, but the UK's interest in Commonwealth and AUKUS connections, perhaps I misread. The final question on Germany about the coalition government. So from Antoine, is it all right?
Sure. Thank you. I will try.
Just perhaps 3 to 5 minutes.
Sure, sure.
Please.
I will try to be very brief and cover a lot. To be clear, the French Indo-Pacific strategy is partly about China, but it is neither solely about China nor against China. So, of course, China is part of the equation, but we are being selfish in defending our interests, so it's not always and only directed at China. In terms of communication, I fully agree with you. We need to communicate much better. The Chinese in the so-called battle of narratives have been very influential. I've been struggling actually over the last few months, last few years to make sure that including the French government could better communicate. You know, every time we have a phone call at the highest level between China and France, the Chinese are the very first one to release a press communique about it. This is the one that the journalists internationally use. And then the French, the Élysée or the Quai d'Orsay, published a statement or a communique a few hours after, and no one read it. So we need also to do better in our own government to be much more reactive in the way we communicate. On NATO, very, very important, but very important to remind everyone, the French territories or anything in the Pacific is not covered by the Article 6 of NATO. But if something happens in the French territory in the South Pacific, then the EU Article 42.7 on mutual defense apply. So this is something quite important. So if French Polynesia, let's take a fictitious scenario, but if French Polynesia is being attacked, NATO is not officially supposed to react because it's not covered, but the EU is supposed to. So Germany, Netherlands, Italy, etc. On the French reaction or overreaction on AUKUS, I think on the political level, it was very important to react very strongly, so to recall the ambassador, etc. I think sometimes the communication was a bit overreacting when our Minister of Foreign Affairs mentioned that Australia gave up its sovereignty of this kind of very strong statement. I think it's not very productive. The key question, as I've said on the very first day, and I was criticized for saying so, is how do we move forward? It's not, of course, to consider that nothing happened, but how do we move forward? How do we move forward with the US? It's ongoing, but how do we move forward in the coming months and years with Australia and the UK, and especially Australia, because geography is not going to change. And New Caledonia will see the result of the referendum in 1 month. French Polynesia is not going to change, is not going to move. So cooperation with Australia will remain. Very last but not least, on the E3 formats, I think it's of course important to remain coordinated with London and Berlin. But I would say that the new E3 formats at the EU level on the Indo-Pacific is no longer with the UK because of Brexit, but is with the Netherlands. So France, Germany, and the Netherlands are the three countries that are actually pushing within the EU for a more assertive EU Indo-Pacific strategy. And even though we have not disagreements, but perspectives that are a little bit different among EU countries. I can tell you that a year ago, where we organized, track 1.5 high-level meeting on the Indo-Pacific, it was, only very few of us expected a draft of a strategy to be released so soon. So it's a great progress. We can discuss it maybe after the question, because I saw a question on that. The EU Indo-Pacific strategy is not perfect, but it's a good start. It's a good move. So the key question now is, how do we move forward? How do we improve it? And how do we coordinate much more as well in drafting our strategy with our Pacific partner, be it Japan, Australia, India, South Korea, and all, but also Taiwan, for example.
Thank you. Alexandra?
Yeah, thank you, Michito, for the excellent discussion questions. Let me try to tackle them. The narrative, I think, there has been some concern, I think, among Germans and also Europeans in more generally to be put totally into the US camp on China and the Indo-Pacific strategy. And this, I think, has not only to do with fear about how China might see this, but I think it's a more comprehensive look at the region. And I think it has some validity, I think, because I think there's some concern that if we all kind of more or less make a common front on China, then it leaves countries, for example, in Southeast Asia in a very difficult position and might put more pressure on them to really take sides. And I think this is also something that in Japan is seen as a problem, that we need to make sure that we can engage with Southeast Asian countries. So in that sense, I think there is some concern to totally be put on the same side as the US. On the other hand, there's a growing recognition that we need to stand up with the US on certain values. So I think the message is kind of mixed. We don't want to be put completely in the US camp. On the other hand, we do see the need to coordinate on certain key values that we want to stand up for. But like I said, I think the Europeans realize that we need to focus on countries, smaller countries like Southeast Asia. And from a German perspective in particular, I think multilateralism is a key dimension that German foreign policy making always focuses on. And in that sense, I think Germans are more prone to focus on organizations like ASEAN as a regional organization. And this may also be a bit different from the US side. And I think what Germans also see is that the US, at least with the AUKUS decision, for now seems to be very much focused on the military realm. And I think this is also where Europeans see some value that they can add, maybe on other issues, not on this kind of hardcore military realm, but rather focus on engaging Asian countries on other issues. So there is some differences from the US approach, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing for Asia. On the second question, the EU, NATO, E3, I think this just shows in some ways the way it can be messy in European affairs with all these organizations. And it will remain probably a messy affair. I think it's very difficult to make a clear division of roles between those different fora, the kind of national level, and then the different regional organizations and what role they play in the Indo-Pacific. So I think it will depend on each policy area, and we have to see which level of governance is most fit for different areas to tackle them. So in that sense, it will remain messy, but I think it's important to realize that each of those organizations or groupings stands for different things and can stand for different things. So NATO can stand for this coordination across the Atlantic. Europe, the EU can stand together as an economically powerful organization. And then E3 can still, I think, play some role in showing that we still continue to coordinate with the UK. So each can have a different role, I think, in that sense. And then On the coalition question, well, let me say this. I don't think foreign policy has played thus far a key role in terms of negotiating kind of where the government wants to go from now. But I'm not surprised about that, because if you look at the ideological leanings of the three parties that are trying to form a government in Germany, they all have very specific areas that they focus on, and they're not foreign policy. So we have a party that's focused on climate and green issues. We have one that's focused on kind of financial things very much. So those are going to be the key issues that they first have to tackle, because they present, they will be the key issues to present to voters in the next election, whether they have gained on that. But that doesn't mean I think that foreign policy is unimportant. And I think the sense that I get from talking to policymakers or to parliamentarians in the past year or so is that there's really a rethink on China, and that's across pretty much all the parties. And in that sense, I think there's more willingness to take a hard line on certain issues that concern China, like, for example, human rights issues. So I do expect that there's going to be some movement on how China is treated by Germany, regardless of the importance at the moment of those issues in coalition building. Thank you.
Thank you. Cleo, please.
Thank you. Those are excellent questions. I particularly like your question about China's discourse, because it gets to the heart of trying to understand what does China want, or more specifically, what does the Chinese Communist Party want, and what is it doing to get it? And this is the political warfare element of Chinese activities. And to answer the other questions, I just very quickly like to explain how I see what the Chinese Communist Party is trying to do, based on its own literature, its own think tank literature, which is to increase China's comprehensive national power to the position of being #1 globally. And their definition of comprehensive is comprehensive. It includes, economic, security, resources, human capital, intellectual property. It's across the board. And it has, because of the unrestricted warfare doctrine, it's not constrained by a lot of the things that many other countries are constrained by. And it is extremely good at identifying individuals or systems that need to be taken over for it to achieve its goals. So I don't see the Chinese Communist Party operating like a normal other country. And if you want to see the difference between, I'm uncomfortable. The reason they say it's China versus the US, so that all those countries that have had a different sort of relationship with the US, some negative, feel like, why should I be aligning with the US? They're just as bad. But what you really need to do is look at what's happened in Hong Kong in 2 years, what's happened in the Solomon Islands in 2 years since they switched from Taiwan to China, to see what an engagement with China actually means. So in that context, all of these organizations are great. Bring it on, AUKUS, E3, whatever works and whatever complicates things for planners in Beijing. Make them as fluid, as adaptable as possible, make them across all sectors, engage with whoever you can engage with, and be very aware of not being used. So, countries have to make a decision about how big a problem they think the Chinese Communist Party is for them. So we saw this very clearly in it. I look a lot at India. And when AUKUS happened, France completely understandably wanted to protect its position in the Indo-Pacific, which it's invested a lot in, and it is a resident power. And it has a relationship with India that is unique, and that's gone back to the 50s or 60s with the space program, for example. So there was very quick rhetoric in the Indian press about the duplicitous Anglo-Saxons and how evil they are, and you can't trust them, and they'll break your heart and stab you in the back, but the French will be there for you. Fine, but that also helps China. So is there a way of protecting your interests, but also growing a comprehensive multinational defense to China's comprehensive national power? And just similarly, kind of on the last point about that, when you talk about countries that want to hedge, countries are not monolithic. We all know that. And so another good case is the S-400 purchase in India. China is looking at buying this, or actually has put money down on buying this Russian missile system. And the Chinese-Indian relationship is finished since Galwan. But if India buys the Russian system, that really helps China. So there's been rumored a lot of Chinese money and influence going in through Russia to get them to buy the system because it'll break the high-tech India-US defense cooperation. People in India who are concerned about China want sanctions on India to try to get them to stop taking the S-400. So the people in those countries that are concerned about China, and there are a lot of them all over Asia, are potential allies in dealing with the China issue, if you think the China issue is also a big deal. And just have a quick question about NATO Article 5.6, which Dr. Bandas brought up. If France qualifies, does Guam qualify? Guam is American territory with American citizens, and China has a missile that its press calls the Guam killer. So, is that a potential NATO situation? That's it. So thank you very much for your great question.
Thank you for all of the responses from these three speakers. Dr. Tsuruoka, do you have any brief reaction to this comment?
No, I'm fine. I'm fine.
Is it fine? Okay. We have a bunch of questions from the audience, so may we move into this session of Q&A. First, the set of questions are concerned with the divisions inside the European Union. How much, different amongst the European Union member states. One of the audience participants asked, for instance, Germany has rushed into this the investment agreement, at the end of the Trump administration, and so this sort of how to view these sort of differences amongst the member states. And then another participant asked, is there any EU member states, strongly opposed to the greater engagement in Indo-Pacific? That is the one set of questions. Another question is on the public opinion of the European nations. Now, they are more or less supportive for the again the greater engagement in this region, or are they relatively unconcerned with this issue? Third, how to gauge the importance of this Indo-Pacific region. If we look at the other, the overriding perhaps priorities like immigrations and the climate change and so on. So the Indo-Pacific is obviously not the dominant policy objective amongst the member states as well as the public opinion. So how to gauge the importance? Now, these three sets of questions perhaps are are somewhat directed to the three of you, but there are some specific questions. One to Antoine. Have you referred perhaps to the amendment process of the EU strategy? one question was concerned about this, and if you're prepared to expand on this. Another question is actually directed at the discussant, Dr. Tsuruoka. How to, what is it, how Japan sees the articulation between the AUKUS and Quad, relationship between this Quad and AUKUS. We have more or less than 20 minutes. So again, each speaker has 3 to maximum 5 minutes. Again, can I ask Antoine to start?
Sure. So a lot to say. Just to reply to Cleo before. Article 6 does not cover Hawaii and Guam. It's not covered. So of course we could discuss it, but legally it's not covered the same way French Polynesia is not covered. So on the mini question, maybe let's start with the European strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So the draft was presented in September, but it's a draft, I would say, in progress. It's not the final strategy. It needs to be adopted once again by the Council and the Parliament. I think there are many things that should be improved to begin an international consultation process to refine the strategy, to characterize the Indo-Pacific by its maritime dimension. That's one of the specificity, to announce or highlight some key initiatives in the strategy, to provide figures and nice fact sheets, I would say, on what the EU is doing in the region. Let's not forget, the EU is the first investor, is the first donor in terms of overseas development aid in the region. It's not even mentioned in the strategy. We need in the document, according to me, to strengthen the focus on civil society, which we do not do enough, to focus even more on the synergies we can have with the country that have their own Indo-Pacific strategy, including Japan, and also to strengthen the concrete cooperation in the field of security, because it's not that much mentioned. And one initiative could be, you know, we have PESCO project, the Permanent Security Cooperation Mechanism at the EU level. We opened it actually to Norway, Canada, and the US on one specific issue related to mobility within Europe. Could be interesting to discuss why not cyber or space security, and to include a project, to open a project to Japan, for example. That's something that should be discussed, according to me, to make the PESCO European project even more concrete. Do European countries oppose the Indo-Pacific strategy? So no one opposes it fully, since we have a draft. So it means that the 27 agree. But of course, when you are in Lithuania, when you are in Slovenia, you are less, I would say, engage in the Indo-Pacific, in the sense that it's not as much as a priority as it could be for the French and the German. Yet, I think it's very important to say that just like the British diplomatic network is being expanded in the Indo-Pacific, it's the same for some Eastern European countries. Lithuania opened an embassy in Australia last year. They will open an embassy in Seoul next year. So even Eastern European countries are expanding in the Indo-Pacific because they understand it is quite important for the Europeans. Very briefly on environmental security, and environment in general, because that's something important for the Europeans. Let's not forget that the Indo-Pacific is 5 out of the 10 largest emitters of greenhouse gases. There is a huge vulnerability of island states within the Indian or the Pacific Oceans. Up to 80% of the migrations linked to climate change, according to the UN, could be in the Indo-Pacific. And 85% of the people living from fishing live in the Indo-Pacific. And last but not least, plastic pollution is something big. And on that plastic pollution, I think we could do even more. The EU could do even more, including with Japan in coordination, etc. Last but not least, just on Taiwan, I think there is a lot that the EU can do on Taiwan. The idea is, of course, not to be provocative, not to change the status quo, but to maintain the status quo. So first, we started to talk openly about Taiwan. That's something important. In June, in the EU-US statement, the maintenance of stability in Taiwan Strait was mentioned. The EU also included Taiwan in its Indo-Pacific strategy as an economic partner, and reminding once again the importance of stability in the Taiwan Strait. We need to do more in terms of technical cooperation. As you know, the Taiwan global cooperation framework was created by US and Taiwan in 2015. Japan joined it in 2019. I think EU could join. The idea is, of course, to benefit from the expertise in Taiwan, but also share our technical expertise. Europe is right now the Commission discussing the so-called anti-coercion instrument. It was initially focused on US, to be very honest, on extraterritorial sanctions from the US. But since China decided to sanction one of us, the Lithuanian, over Taiwan with economic sanctions, it's also important for us to use the anti-coercion instrument in the way we're designing it right now at the Commission level to include, of course, Chinese coercion. And very last, on the MEP visits, as you know, Taiwan, European MEPs, including the French Raphael Glucksmann, visited Taiwan recently. I think we could do even more. And for the very first time, why not think of, I actually offered it already last year, a joint visit by MPs and MEPs, let's say British, French, German and European MEPs all together to Taiwan to show that we coordinate, that our objective is once again not to change the status quo, but to maintain the status quo and stability in the strait. And I think it's also in Japan's interest.
Good. Alexandra, please.
Yeah, thank you. I think Antoine has already done a great job in highlighting a lot of things, particularly on the approach to China. I totally agree with him. So I only want to add a few things. I think, I mean, as Antoine said, there's the China challenge is not as important in all European countries, of course, but I think overall what we see is a narrowing of opinions or views on how China is viewed in Europe, and the EU strategy is an expression of this narrowing of differences, I think. But nevertheless, I think on the other hand, there's a continuing challenge that, of course, China tries to pick out some countries that may appear particularly weak for influence. We've seen it with Chinese investments in Greece, and then pressure on Greece to take particular China-friendly positions in the EU, etc. So I think this will be a continuing challenge. And I think here again, Antoine did a great job in already noting the anti-coercion instrument, which could be an important way to demonstrate more solidarity among European countries, and if China puts pressure on one country to try to respond to that. So I think this is an important way to strengthen European cohesion on that. I think there was also a question on public opinion and the problem of different priorities, given that Europe has a lot of other challenges, not just the Indo-Pacific. And this is, of course, true. And I think taking those two questions together, I think what I see is that there may be some gap between the elite level and the public level. I think the elite level has become quite concerned about developments in the Indo-Pacific, challenges to the maritime order, the Indo-Pacific becoming more important in terms of setting trade rules with RCEP and CTPPP. And cybersecurity may just be decided kind of in the Indo-Pacific, how those dynamics will go. So I think there's a lot of concern on the elite level about the Indo-Pacific, and on the public level, on the other hand, I think there's still a lack of really concrete interest. I think in general, public opinion about China has deteriorated over the past years, including in Germany. So there's a realization that China is not this new friendly hegemon, possibly. But on the other hand, I think there's still a lack of recognition of why the Indo-Pacific is so important. And the German frigate is a very good example. You will see very little media coverage of the frigate's visit to the Indo-Pacific in Germany. So that shows that it's not very central to public opinion here. So I think there could be more efforts to really explain to the public here in Germany why we're doing this, why it's so important. I think that would be a good thing. I just want to briefly also talk about Taiwan. I think the question was about military engagement. I think the question was saying that the balance of power is so important in the Taiwan Strait, and to what extent we will see more European engagement. I think France has taken a bit different position by already having basically a ship in a dock in Taiwan basically recently. But I think Germany will be very cautious to get involved militarily at all. But still, it's important, I think, again, this international messaging, I think, can be quite important to change the strategic calculus of the Chinese side, to show that Europeans are concerned about Taiwan, that there may be consequences if China makes any kind of move on Taiwan. So I think there's something that the Europeans can do. And they can also try to help Taiwan get more international space, for example, through this global cooperation and training framework that Antoine has mentioned. I think this would be a really good way for Europe to become more involved with Taiwan. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Cleo, please.
Thank you, Professor Endo. On the importance of the Indo-Pacific, so the UK is in a little bit of a different position post-Brexit, right? It needs to make new friends, especially around trade, as quickly as it can. And the psychology that's predominant in the government sees Britain sees a long history of Britain, shall I put it that way, of engagement and of being part of the region. So the Indo-Pacific is very important to a post-Brexit UK in many, many different sectors. With your indulgence, Professor Endo, there's a couple of questions about Russia. Do you mind if I bring that in?
Please, go ahead.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, because I think it's really important. The Sino-Russian relationship is obviously complex, but in terms of common goals, it is in lockstep. And some of the common goals is to weaken Western alliances and to gain influence. And it's very worth remembering that Russia is not the Soviet Union, but a lot of the people who have a lot of power in Russia came of age during the Soviet Union. And Russia may not be quite the superpower it used to be, but it is an intelligent superpower. So if you're from a non-aligned country, which a lot of countries in Asia are, and you're in governance now, so if you're in your 50s or 60s and you're reaching kind of 70s, the height of your career, you would have been a young man or woman during the time of the Soviet Union, and you probably would have gone to do some training in Russia at some point, the Soviet Union at some point. And they would have made sure you had a very good time, and they would have kept track of you during the whole development of your career, and those relationships would have continued. So that's something that Russia can bring to its relationship with China when it's trying to engage in political warfare. You can, again, see it very clearly in places like India around things like the S-400, but the same is true in a lot of other countries. All across the Indo-Pacific. So Russia has leverage that is not as visible, but it is very effective. And as we saw with the Russia-China sail through Japan, they're willing to work together quite openly in the Indo-Pacific over common goals. And those common goals are, weakening alliances from the inside. In some places, China's more effective. In some places, Russia's more effective. The other relationship that's very important for a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific is the Wahhabi-China relationship. So again, that's a potential proxy cudgel that China can use. We see it in places like Bangladesh, where its relationship with Pakistan is creating, just within the past month, attacks on temples, Hindus getting killed, and a lot of domestic unrest. And China is fine with domestic unrest. They're fine with authoritarian governments, because authoritarian governments, like we saw, with Myanmar, have a much harder time engaging with the West. So their politicians have fewer options, and so that gets them even deeper in with China. So it is perfectly fine for China to do, again, what it's doing in the Solomon Islands, which is take a situation that was relatively stable, make it more unstable, and back authoritarian leadership, so that the next time the Solomons have a civil war, it's not the Australian peacekeepers who go in, it's the Chinese peacekeepers who go in. So China's use of willing partners, whether it be Russia in many examples, or straightforward terrorists, as they've protected at the UN Security Council coming out of Pakistan, is a problem for a lot of countries across Asia. Thank you.
Good. Michito, please.
Thank you very much. Very quickly on the Quad and AUKUS. The Quad and AUKUS, they are different animals, different beasts. So they are doing different things. So while the Quad is a more informal, flexible sort of framework, but at the same time, the AUKUS is really rigid and exclusive framework by nature, because it's about, first and foremost, about nuclear submarines, which is really a secret and sensitive technology. So it cannot be open to anyone who are interested in to join. It's just impossible. So by nature, these two are different things. But the important thing is that the different frameworks are doing different jobs. And as a result of that, what we can see is a division of labor between different frameworks and different forums. And it's just good because the Indo-Pacific region is quite vast area. So the different countries, different framework, doing different jobs, and it's just fine. And also it's really important that the Quad remains a flexible framework, and that is why we can cooperate with other countries as well. So perhaps in a Quad plus something framework involving France or the UK or other countries in the region as well. So it's really important to maintain Quad a flexible framework. But at the same time, there are some concerns about this, because the Quad originally was supposed to be more about security and defense cooperation. But in the end, what we are seeing is that the Quad is working on vaccine diplomacy or technology cooperation, which is good. But if this is a result of sort of hesitancies among countries for strengthening security and defense cooperation, or as a result of lack of progress in security and defense field, then I don't think it's a good sign. But as long as there's a new agenda, broader agenda going well in the Quad framework, so it's, for the moment, it's okay. But at least sometime in the future, we might have to look at whether this is really what we intended to do, because the security and defense cooperation, of course, is going to remain important as well. So this is, but anyway, the good thing about the AUKUS is that nowadays, thanks to AUKUS, which is seen as a sort of bad cop, so Quad is now seen as very much good cop, because the Quad used to be seen as very bad cop. So it's a huge change. So thanks to AUKUS. So this is, I'm saying this half jokingly, but half seriously. Thank you.
Antoine, briefly, please.
Because it was said that a French ship docked in Taiwan. Actually, it was announced in August that a ship, La Provence, anchored close to Taiwan, but it was not actually confirmed. It was actually a wrong message and a wrong information. So just to be clear, I mean, no French Navy ship anchored or docked on the island of Taiwan. We have ships transiting through the Taiwan Strait, Dupuy de l'Homme once again a few weeks ago, but no French Navy ship this year docking, I would say, in the Taiwan port. Just to be clear, because otherwise it might escalate.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed for panelists, and I would like to extend our thanks to the administrators as well as fellows under the leadership of Director General Ichikawa. I'm so sorry that I have to announce that we have exhausted our time, perhaps energy, but it was really a dense discussion, highly stimulating within the limit of 90 minutes only, right? I have a few additional questions, but I'm sorry that I can't take them all. But the four panelists have taken in some additional questions on Taiwan and Russia, and it was great. I appreciate it very much. So we have to close this session, but I again would like to reiterate our gratitude for all of you, especially the four panelists. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.